We are obsessed with finding peace and quiet. We buy noise-canceling headphones. We retreat to silent meditation centers. We complain about the endless noise of the modern world. But absolute silence is empirically terrifying to the human animal. In fact, if you strip away all external stimulation, the vast majority of people will deliberately inflict physical pain on themselves just to make the quiet stop. A paradox? No. Pure neuroscience. We love to blame smartphones for our fractured attention. We tell ourselves that endless notifications ruined our natural, ancient ability to sit gracefully alone with our thoughts. But this is a comfortable myth. Your inability to sit still isn't a modern failing. It is a feature embedded deep in the metabolic structure of your brain. Silence isn't peace. It is a terrifying neurological mirror, and your biology is desperate to look away. Over the next few minutes, we are going to completely tear down the romanticized illusion of mental rest. I want to show you the hidden architecture of the mind when it is forced into neutral. Once you see the relentless, aggressive machinery that your brain spins up when you give it absolutely nothing to do, you will never look at boredom or yourself in quite the same way again. Let's start with a brutal experiment. Imagine you are placed in a perfectly empty room. No phone in your pocket, no books, no windows, no tasks. Just you, 4 blank walls, and 15 minutes of ticking time. But there is one object in the room with you, a button. A button that, if pressed, delivers a painful electric shock directly to your body. Would you press it? You probably think you wouldn't. You think you would just sit there, finally enjoying a rare moment of uninterrupted peace. In 2014, the neuroscientist Timothy Wilson actually ran this exact experiment. The results were staggering. 67% of male participants chose to willingly electrocute themselves. Some pressed the button multiple times. 67%. They didn't shock themselves because they were masochists. They shocked themselves because 15 minutes of pure, unadulterated consciousness was utterly unbearable. They mathematically proved the exact staggering premium the human animal places on escaping its own internal narrative. Physical pain was vastly preferred over cognitive absence. Think about your own life. How long does it take, sitting alone in a quiet room, before your hand involuntarily reaches for your phone? 3 minutes? 30 seconds? You judge yourself for this. You call it a lack of discipline. But what you are experiencing is not weakness. It is cognitive friction. Your brain requires resistance from the outside world to regulate itself. To understand this, you need to look at your brain not as a quiet sanctuary, but as an engine. When you sit in a silent room, you are taking a high-performance engine and shifting it into neutral. But you are leaving a brick on the gas pedal. Without the friction of external tasks to absorb that immense kinetic energy, the RPMs immediately spike dangerously high. Your brain is quite literally revving out of control. It is consuming 20% of your body's total energy, even though it weighs just 2%. That energy has to go somewhere. When there is no external problem to solve, no email to answer, no predator to escape, the machinery doesn't power down. It turns entirely inward, devouring its own psychological exhaust. This brings us to the evolutionary mismatch. We evolved in an environment where static isolation was a biological signal of impending danger. If a primate in the wild is sitting completely still in total silence, it means one of two things. It is either completely isolated from the safety of its tribe, or a predator is silently stalking it from the brush. Our neurology is built for constant, relentless environmental scanning. It is looking for threats, looking for opportunities, tracking social dynamics. Absolute quiet was never a feature of the ancestral environment. It was an anomaly. So, when you try to meditate or simply sit on your sofa in silence, your nervous system doesn't register peace. It registers a threat. Have you ever laid in bed at night, perfectly safe, doors locked, but your heart is racing as your mind cycles through every awkward thing you've said over the last 10 years? That is your ancient threat detection software, desperately searching for a problem to solve because the environment has become suspiciously quiet. It is manufacturing danger to keep the engine engaged. We are not running from silence because we are modern, broken humans addicted to dopamine. We are running from silence because our brain is an aggressive, proactive survival machine that views a lack of data as a critical system failure. When you remove the world, the brain violently forces you to confront its own relentlessly spinning gears. We have quantified exactly how far we will go to avoid this state. We know that we are willing to literally shock our own nervous system just to escape our thoughts. But this leaves us with a far more terrifying question. If we are willing to inflict pain to avoid the quiet, what exactly is happening inside the skull the moment the external world goes dark? For decades, the foundational assumption in neuroscience was beautifully simple. When you close your eyes and stop performing tasks, your brain finally powers down. We imagined the mind as a light switch. You stop interacting with the world, the switch flips off, and the neural machinery goes quiet to rest. It is a comforting thought. It is also entirely, violently wrong. In the early 2000s, a neuroscientist named Marcus Raichle was looking at brain scans of people staring at a blank screen. He expected to see a dark, inactive cortex. Instead, he discovered an anomaly that shattered our understanding of human consciousness. The moment the subjects stopped doing anything, a massive, hidden network of brain regions suddenly flared to life. Raichle had accidentally discovered what we now call the default mode network. This is the brain's internal operating system. When you strip away the demands of the outside world, when you stop reading, stop talking, stop solving external problems, your brain does not turn off. It simply shifts its processing power entirely inward, igniting a neurological firestorm. And here is where the math becomes staggering. Your brain accounts for roughly 2% of your body weight. yet it consumes a massive 20% of your body's total energy budget. But here is the true paradigm shift. The vast majority of that energy is not spent on active thinking or solving complex equations. It is burned in the background by the default mode network when you are supposedly doing absolutely nothing. This is why trying to force your mind into a state of total emptiness feels so physically exhausting. You are not battling a lack of discipline. You are fighting a metabolic powerhouse that is firing on all cylinders. Think about those moments you try to meditate, and your mind feels louder than a crowded room. That noise is not a failure of focus. It is the sound of your internal machinery roaring to life because the external friction is gone. So, what exactly is this incredibly expensive network doing with all that energy? In the absence of an immediate physical task, the default mode network becomes an aggressive time travel machine. It immediately begins stitching together fragments of your past to simulate potential futures. It forces you to mentally rehearse scenarios, analyzing social dynamics, past failures, and impending threats. Consider how evolution shaped this mechanism. An organism doesn't survive by simply reacting to what is directly in front of it. It survives by predicting the future. The default mode network is the ultimate prediction engine. When it isn't burdened with processing your immediate surroundings, it projects your consciousness forward in time, obsessively mapping out every conceivable danger before it ever materializes. We casually dismiss this biological process as merely overthinking. But for your nervous system, this is high-stakes survival calculation. When you lie awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a minor social interaction from 3 days ago, your brain is not trying to torture you. It is running a highly sophisticated algorithm. It wants to ensure that you never make that exact same mistake again when the stakes are truly life or death. The irony is that we treat this internal simulation as a psychological defect. We buy apps and attend retreats hoping to silence the chatter. But the default mode network is precisely what allowed human beings to build civilizations. We are the only species that can detach from the present moment, construct an entirely fictional reality in our minds, test different outcomes, and then return to the present to change our behavior. You cannot turn this system off any more than you can consciously stop your liver from filtering blood. When the external world goes quiet, the internal world must, by biological necessity, become loud. This is why isolation is fundamentally incompatible with the architecture of the human brain. The silence we crave conceptually is the exact environment that triggers our most intense internal labor. This metabolic reality fundamentally shifts how we should view our relationship with quietness. The exhaustion you feel after a day of doing nothing is not an illusion. Your brain has been running marathon-level simulations of reality, burning vast reserves of glucose just to keep the internal narrative alive. We are constantly running from the sheer intensity of our own operating system. We use distraction not because we are fundamentally broken, but because it forces the brain to shift power back to the outside world, giving us a brief reprieve from the default mode network. So we now understand that the brain aggressively creates its own internal reality just to stay busy. It manufactures a relentless stream of data to fill the vacuum of a quiet room. But this forces us to confront an even more radical frontier of neuroscience. If the mind hallucinates problems just because you are sitting quietly on your sofa, what happens if we strip away the last remaining physical inputs? What happens to human consciousness if we force it into an environment of absolute, uncompromising silence? To find out, we have to look at what happens when humans are placed inside the quietest place on Earth. It is an anechoic chamber at Orfield Laboratories in Minnesota, engineered to absorb 99.99% of all sound. No traffic, no wind, no hum of electricity. It is the absolute acoustic zero. And instead of finding profound peace, the human mind shatters. Within minutes of sitting in the dark, subjects do not experience emptiness. First, they hear the heavy, rhythmic thumping of their own heartbeat. Then, the wet, mechanical shifting of their lungs, expanding and contracting. Soon after, they can hear the high-pitched grinding of their own skeletal joints moving. The silence becomes deafeningly loud. But the horror does not stop at human anatomy. Once the brain runs out of physiological noises to track, it begins to invent its own. Subjects report hearing phantom melodies, distant voices, or the sound of rushing water that simply isn't there. When starved of reality, the human mind refuses to wait in the dark. It aggressively begins to manufacture a world. Here is the paradox we have to wrestle with. We intuitively believe that the brain is a passive receiver, that it just sits inside the skull, waiting for the eyes and ears to deliver information. We assume that if we shut off the inputs, the screen goes blank and the speakers go mute. But the exact opposite is true. As neuroscientists like Lisa Feldman Barrett have demonstrated, your brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. It does not simply react to the world, it guesses the world. At every millisecond, it projects a rapid-fire hallucination of what it expects to hear, and then uses external sensory data from the environment to correct the guess. Think of it like a microphone feeding back on itself on a stage. When the sound engineer cuts all the external audio, the system doesn't just quietly power down. Instead, the amplifier automatically turns up the internal gain, desperately searching for a signal. Eventually, the baseline electronic static catches in a loop, escalating into a deafening screech. In the absolute silence of the anechoic chamber, your brain's amplifier gets turned up to maximum capacity. It is searching frantically for the ambient noise of a forest, the rustle of a predator, or the voice of a tribe member. Finding nothing, it catches the baseline static of your nervous system and amplifies it into full-blown auditory signals. This brings us to a terrifying, beautiful realization about the architecture of human consciousness. Perception is not something that happens to you. It is something your brain actively constructs. And in the absence of truth, the mind will always choose a fabricated hallucination over the terrifying void of absolute nothingness. Which fundamentally flips how we understand our modern culture of constant stimulation. We have been sold a pervasive narrative that our addiction to smartphones, podcasts, and endless scrolling is an unnatural anomaly. We are told that technology has somehow ruined our pure ancient ability to just sit quietly with our own thoughts. But evolutionary psychology tells a very different story. Your ancestors were never designed to sit idly in perfect safety. To a hunter-gatherer, a sudden lack of sensory input, the forest going completely silent, was not a moment for meditation. It was a terrifying biological alarm that a predator was nearby. Total quiet meant imminent death. The smartphone in your pocket is not overriding a natural state of Zen. It is acting as a hyper-efficient pacifier for an ancient evolutionary feature. We bombard ourselves with external data because it regulates this predictive overload. It gives the brain the friction it desperately needs to avoid turning that sensory microphone inward. Distraction, therefore, is not a failure of modern discipline. It is a highly successful coping mechanism. You swipe through feeds and leave the television playing in empty rooms because your neurology knows that if the external data stops, the internal simulation will spin out of control. You are actively managing the gain on your own internal amplifier. So we arrive at a startling new baseline for what it means to be human. The noise we run away from is not the modern world. The noise we are running from is the raw, unedited operating system of our own survival machinery, constantly predicting threats in the shadows of a quiet room. We now know that silence is not empty. It is a high-octane hallucination machine. The brain is quite literally incapable of doing nothing. So how do we actually live inside a mind that refuses to stop running? If we cannot turn the engine off, how do we survive the friction of shifting gears? When you step from blinding sunlight into a pitch-black room, you do not immediately assume you have lost your vision. You understand that your retinas simply need time to chemically adjust before the shapes in the dark begin to emerge. Psychological quiet works exactly the same way. The visceral discomfort you feel when the room goes still is not a flaw. It is the raw, metabolic friction of shifting gears. Your brain is physically transitioning power from the external executive network to the internal default mode. That sudden spike of anxiety, that desperate, clawing urge to check your phone or turn on a screen, is just the neurological equivalent of your eyes adjusting to the dark. It is an ancient survival mechanism panicking because it has no immediate physical threats to calculate. Look at the hidden architecture we have uncovered. The men in the laboratory eagerly choosing electric shocks over their own thoughts. The subjects in the anechoic chamber hallucinating the sound of their own bones. the massive 20% energy budget burning through your cortex at 3 in the morning. None of this is a glitch or a modern pathology. It is the exact same mechanism operating exactly as it was designed. It is the sound of an aggressive prediction engine starved of external data. We spend our lives believing we are simply prone to boredom, or that the digital world has ruined our attention spans. But the truth is infinitely more complex. You do not fear silence because it is empty. You fear it because without the friction of the outside world, your brain violently forces you to confront its relentless simulation of reality. And this is where the paradigm entirely shifts. For decades, we have been sold a biological impossibility. We have been taught that the ultimate pinnacle of human development is to achieve a perfectly quiet, empty mind. We treat our internal noise as a disease that must be cured through disciplined meditation or escaped through distraction. But you cannot silence an organ built to keep you alive by forecasting danger. The actual goal is not to force the engine to stop spinning. The goal is to stop treating your brain's natural internal simulation as a threat. The noise you hear in the quiet is simply your operating system doing its job, trying to solve a future that has not even happened yet. Once you stop trying to escape it, the biological panic response begins to fade. You realize that the thoughts racing through your head are not entirely who you are. They are just data outputs from a highly evolved survival algorithm. You stop being the prisoner of the simulation and you become its witness. Which brings us to a frontier that the science of consciousness is only just beginning to navigate. If your brain's default, unprompted state is to obsessively simulate future problems, and if those anxieties are just mechanical processes running on metabolic autopilot, who or what is the quiet entity inside you that is actually observing those simulations? Who is the witness watching the machine? Try a small experiment tonight. When you sit on the edge of your bed and the room goes perfectly still, notice the immediate reflex to reach for a screen. Do not fight it and do not judge it. Just pause your hand for 10 seconds. Feel the physical spike of cortisol in your chest. Watch your brain desperately scramble for data. Observe the machinery as it powers up. The silence is never going to be empty. It will always be loud, and it will always be demanding. But the moment you recognize the noise as a simple biological reflex, it ceases to be a cage. You are finally free to sit in the dark, let the engine run, and simply watch what it builds.